A mother's love is supposed to be unconditional, protective, eternal. But in this story, love had a condition. And when that condition was broken, so was the life of a young man who never saw it coming. The body was found just after midnight. Neighbors had heard the screaming first. Then the silence, thick, suffocating. The kind that doesn't come with peace but with something darker. When the police arrived at the modest bungalow in Lagos, they were met with a sight that didn't make sense. Blood soaked into the tiled floor, pooling beneath the lifeless body of Ezekiel Adeyemi, 21 years old. A brilliant university student. A son. A future lawyer. His throat had been slashed. And standing in the doorway, trembling hands gripping a knife, was his own mother, Rebecca Adeyemi, the woman who had raised him, fed him, held him when he cried as a child. Now she stood over his body, her white nightgown soaked in his blood. She didn't run. She didn't fight when the officers handcuffed her. She only whispered one thing before they took her away. He shouldn't have seen. What did Ezekiel see? Why did his mother kill him? To understand, we have to go back to where this all began. Ezekiel had always been his mother's pride. The only child of a woman who had sacrificed everything to give him a future. His father was long gone, left when Ezekiel was just a baby, leaving Rebecca to raise him alone. She worked hard, selling fabric at the market by day, cleaning offices by night. Everything she did was for Ezekiel. She made sure he went to the best schools, made sure he never wanted for anything. But there was one thing Ezekiel never questioned: why his mother never remarried. He had grown up hearing the whispers, that she was too close to a particular woman, a longtime friend, Amina Bello, that there was something unnatural about their friendship. But Ezekiel never cared. His mother was his world. She was the strongest person he knew. Until the night he walked in on a truth he wasn't supposed to see. It was late when Ezekiel arrived home from school that evening. He had been studying for an important exam, staying late in the library. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. Maybe if he had arrived just 30 minutes later, none of this would have happened. But fate is cruel. As he stepped inside, the house was dimly lit. His mother's bedroom door was slightly ajar. He heard voices, low, intimate whispers followed by soft laughter. And then he saw them. His mother and Amina Bello. Together. Too close. Lips brushing. Hands intertwined. Something inside Ezekiel shattered. He had grown up in a society where love like that wasn't just taboo, it was dangerous. And in that moment, everything he thought he knew about his mother collapsed. "Mummy?" His voice cracked. The women froze. Rebecca turned, horror and panic flashing across her face. Ezekiel stumbled back, shaking his head. "No, this isn't, what are you doing?" Rebecca stepped forward. "Zeke, please." But he wasn't listening. He was already reaching for his phone, his breath coming fast. "You lied to me," he shouted. Amina grabbed Rebecca's hand, pulling her back. He wasn't supposed to know. And then Ezekiel made the mistake that sealed his fate. He picked up his phone. "I have to tell someone." Rebecca's heart stopped. She had spent years hiding her secret. Years making sure no one knew. Because she knew what would happen if the truth came out. She would lose everything. Her business. Her respect. Her freedom. And now her own son was about to expose her. Rebecca stepped forward, her hands trembling. Ezekiel put the phone down. "No," he spat. "I trusted you. This is wrong. This is..." Amina's eyes darkened. If he tells, we're finished? Rebecca's mind spun. Her own son. The boy she had raised, loved, sacrificed for. He was about to ruin her life. And she couldn't let that happen. The argument that followed shook the walls of the house. Ezekiel shouted, Rebecca begged, Amina hissed warnings. And then, the struggle. The moment Ezekiel turned his back, Rebecca lunged. The kitchen knife was in her hand before she even realized what she was doing. It should have just been a warning. But then the blade found flesh. Ezekiel gasped. The phone slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. Blood spilled down his chest. His knees buckled. Rebecca let out a strangled cry as he collapsed, his wide, shocked eyes looking up at her. She had stabbed her own son. The silence that followed was deafening. Amina grabbed Rebecca's arm, voice shaking. "We have to go." But Rebecca just stared at Ezekiel's body, her own hands trembling. He had only wanted the truth. And now he was dead for it. The neighbors had heard the screams. By the time the police arrived, Amina had vanished. Rebecca was still there, standing in the pool of her son's blood. She didn't run. She didn't try to explain. She just whispered one final thing before they took her away. "He shouldn't have seen. The police station was silent except for the slow ticking of the clock. Rebecca Adeyemi sat in the interrogation room, her hands cuffed in front of her, dried blood staining the hem of her dress. She hadn't asked for a lawyer. She hadn't asked for water. She just sat there, staring at the table, replaying the moment her son's life drained from his body. He shouldn't have seen. Those words clung to the air like the last breath Ezekiel had taken. Detective Tund Becker stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. He had been in the force for over 20 years. He had seen men kill for money, for revenge, for power. But a mother killing her own child? He took a seat across from her, studying her face. She didn't look like a murderer. But the body at the crime scene said otherwise. "Mrs. Adeyemi," he said, his voice measured. "Do you understand why you're here?" She nodded. "Then tell me, why did you do it?" For the first time, Rebecca's hands trembled. He was going to tell? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Becker frowned. "Tell what?" Silence. "Then, about me. About us." Becker's jaw tightened. He had suspected, but now it was confirmed. Rebecca had killed her son to protect her secret. He leaned forward. "So you stabbed him?" Rebecca swallowed hard. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Then how was it supposed to happen? She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, there was a knock on the door. An officer stepped in, looking uneasy. "Sir, we found something." Becker stood. "Stay here," he told Rebecca, though he knew she wasn't going anywhere. The crime scene was still active when Becker arrived. The body had already been removed, but the blood remained. Officers were combing through the house, looking for anything that could add clarity to the case. "What did you find?" Becker asked. One of the forensic officers handed him a plastic evidence bag. Inside was Ezekiel's phone. The screen was cracked, but it was still unlocked. Becker scrolled through the messages. Then he saw it. A text Ezekiel had been typing, but never sent. "Mara, I just found out something about my mom. I don't know what to do. I think she's in danger." The message was unsent. Interrupted. Because by the time he could press send, he was already bleeding out on the floor. Becker's grip tightened on the phone. Ezekiel hadn't been trying to expose his mother. He had been trying to protect her. Back at the station, Rebecca sat motionless when Becker re-entered the room. "Your son was trying to help you," he said, tossing the phone onto the table. "He thought you were in danger." Rebecca flinched at the sight of the phone, as if it burned her. "You didn't even let him explain, did you?" Becker continued, his voice sharper now. "You saw the phone and you assumed the worst." A tear slipped down Rebecca's cheek. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. I panicked." "No," Becker said, shaking his head. "You didn't panic. You made a choice." Rebecca's fingers curled into fists. "What choice did I have?" she shot back suddenly. "Do you know what they would have done to me if people found out? What they would have done to Amina?" Becker exhaled. He knew. Nigeria was not kind to people like Rebecca. A secret like hers wasn't just shameful, it was dangerous. But none of that changed the fact that her son was dead. "Where is Amina?" he asked. Rebecca's lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, another officer stepped into the room. "Sir, we just got word. Amina Bello has fled the country." Becker let out a slow breath. Rebecca closed her eyes. She had killed her own son to protect a woman who had already left her behind. That night, as Rebecca sat alone in her cell, she thought of Ezekiel. She thought of his laugh. The way he used to hold her hand when he was little. The way he had defended her against everything, until the moment she became the monster he never saw coming. She had spent her whole life hiding. But now the whole world would know. And it had cost her the one person who had ever truly loved her. The prison cell was cold. Damp. Rebecca sat on the narrow cot, her arms wrapped around herself. It had been 2 days since her arrest, 2 days since her world collapsed. She hadn't spoken much since the interrogation. She had nothing left to say. She had spent years living in silence. Now the silence had become her prison. Detective Tund Becker sat at his desk, staring at the case file in front of him. The evidence was airtight. Rebecca had confessed. The murder weapon had been found at the scene. But something still didn't sit right. Why had Amina disappeared the moment Ezekiel was killed? And why had Rebecca, who had spent her life sacrificing for her son, suddenly decided to kill him? There was something missing. He picked up the phone. "Give me a location on Amina Bello." If Rebecca wouldn't talk, maybe Amina would. Mara Dyke sat in her tiny apartment, staring at her phone. She still hadn't processed it. Ezekiel was dead. Her best friend. The boy who had spent years sneaking her extra snacks in school, who had defended her when no one else did. And the person who had taken his life? His own mother. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the tears away. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Mara Dyke? The voice on the other end was deep, firm. Yes, who's this? Detective Becker. I need to ask you about Ezekiel. Mara sat up straighter. Okay. Did he ever tell you he was afraid of his mother? Mara exhaled. No. Never. Did he ever mention Amina Bello? Silence. Then. Yes, Mara said slowly. Once. Becker's grip tightened on the phone. What did he say? Mara swallowed hard. That he didn't trust her. The police combed through every possible lead, but Amina Bello had vanished. Her bank accounts were empty. Her phone had been switched off. It was as if she had never existed. And that only made Becker more certain. Amina had something to do with this. And Rebecca was protecting her. The next morning, Rebecca was brought back into the interrogation room. Becker placed a single photograph on the table. Amina Bello. Rebecca didn't flinch. Where is she? Becker asked. Rebecca's lips pressed together. She's gone, she finally said. You knew she was leaving, didn't you? Pause. Then a slow nod. Becker exhaled. She convinced you to kill Ezekiel, didn't she? Rebecca's body stiffened. It wasn't like that, she whispered. Then tell me how it was, Becker pressed. Rebecca closed her eyes. And when she spoke, her voice broke. I didn't plan to kill him. Then why did you? Rebecca let out a shaky breath. Because Amina told me I had no choice. The night Ezekiel died, Rebecca had begged Amina for a way out. He won't tell anyone. He's my son. But Amina had seen the fear in Rebecca's eyes. Fear of the whispers. Fear of the shame. Fear of what would happen if Ezekiel changed his mind. If you love me, Amina had whispered, then you know what you have to do. Rebecca had stared at her in horror. No. But Amina had grabbed her hands, squeezing tight. It's him or us, Rebecca. The words had echoed in her skull as she stood in the kitchen, gripping the knife. The moment Ezekiel had turned his back, she had lunged. And now Amina was gone. Rebecca had killed for her. And Amina had left her to rot. Becker leaned back, exhaling sharply. She used you. Rebecca swallowed hard. She had killed her only son. For a woman who had never planned to stay. And now she had nothing left. That night, as Rebecca lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, she whispered the only words that mattered. I'm sorry, Ezekiel. But the dead don't forgive. And neither would she. Because if Amina thought she was free, she was wrong. Rebecca had nothing left to lose. And vengeance was the only thing keeping her alive. The sun had barely risen over Lagos when Detective Becker received the call. They had found her. Amina Bello had been tracked to a small hotel in Accra, Ghana. She had checked in under a false name, paid in cash, and kept a low profile. But she had made one mistake. She used her real passport at the border. Becker wasted no time. Within hours, a request for extradition was sent. Amina thought she had escaped. But her past was coming for her. Rebecca sat in her prison cell, staring at the wall. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. She barely spoke. The other inmates whispered about her, the woman who had killed her own son. But Rebecca didn't care. She was waiting. For news. For closure. For the moment Amina would sit where she sat now. When Becker finally entered the cell block, Rebecca sat up, her hands gripping the edge of the cot. We found her, he said simply. Rebecca exhaled. She had spent so many years hiding. But now, Amina would finally have to face the truth. Amina was silent during the flight back to Nigeria. She didn't fight. She didn't resist. She only spoke when they landed. I want a lawyer, she said calmly. Becker smirked. You'll need one. She had run. She had abandoned Rebecca. But she had left behind too many loose ends. Amina had spent years manipulating people. But this time, there was no one left to save her. The trial was a media sensation. Rebecca's confession had already sealed her fate, life imprisonment. But now all eyes were on Amina. Would she walk free? Or would she pay the price for the blood on her hands? As the prosecutor laid out the case, Amina remained composed. Did you convince Rebecca Adeyemi to kill her own son? Amina shook her head. I had nothing to do with Ezekiel's death. Murmurs filled the courtroom. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. Then why did you flee the country? Amina sighed. Because I was afraid. Rebecca acted on her own. I had no idea what she was planning. And then, we have proof that says otherwise. The prosecution dropped the bombshell. They had recovered Amina's call logs. The night Ezekiel was murdered, Amina had called Rebecca 5 times. She had been at the house. She had heard everything. She had told Rebecca what to do. And the moment Ezekiel was dead, she had run. The courtroom erupted. And Amina? For the first time, her mask cracked. It took the jury only 3 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. Amina Bello was sentenced to 25 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. As she was led away in handcuffs, her eyes met Rebecca's through the bars of the holding cell. Amina's face was filled with fury. Rebecca's? Empty. There was no more love. No more pain. Just silence. Amina had used her. Now they would both rot together. That night, Rebecca lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling. She had lost everything, her son, her freedom, her life. And for what? A love that was never real. A secret that never should have been kept. For the first time she whispered a prayer. Not for forgiveness, but for the one thing she knew she would never get. A second chance. But there are no second chances in prison. Only regret. Prison had a way of breaking people. For Rebecca Adeyemi, the days blurred into nights, the walls closing in around her like a cage built from her own mistakes. She had once believed she was fighting to protect her life, but in the end, all she had done was destroy it. The air inside the women's prison was thick with whispers. Everyone knew who she was. Some pitied her. Some despised her. But no one feared her. She wasn't a hardened criminal. She was just a mother who had made an unthinkable choice. A choice that had stolen her son's future. A choice that had left her with nothing. Amina Bello adjusted slowly to prison life, but one thing was clear. She was not like Rebecca. She hadn't lost everything. Unlike Rebecca, she still had visitors. Friends. People who still saw her as the victim in this story. Rebecca watched from across the prison yard as Amina sat with a group of women, laughing, smiling, living. As if Ezekiel's blood wasn't on her hands. As if she hadn't whispered in Rebecca's ear that night, "It's him or us." As if she hadn't walked away, leaving Rebecca to face the consequences alone. Rebecca's nails dug into her palms. She had killed for Amina. And Amina had let her rot. Months passed. Then one night, Rebecca received an unexpected visitor. Mara Dyke. She had grown thinner, her face shadowed by the grief that hadn't left her since Ezekiel's murder. Rebecca didn't know what to say. Why did you do it? Mara asked, her voice raw. Rebecca swallowed hard. I thought I had no choice. Mara's eyes burned with anger. You did have a choice. You could have chosen him. The words hit like a knife. Because Mara was right. Rebecca had spent years fearing what the world would think of her. She had spent years hiding a secret. And in the end, she had let that fear take her own child's life. I wish I could take it back, Rebecca whispered. Mara's hands clenched into fists. But you can't. And with that she walked away, leaving Rebecca to drown in the truth. 1 year passed. Then 2. And then, something unexpected happened. Amina was attacked. It happened in the middle of the night. No one saw who did it. No one admitted to anything. But by the time the guards found her, she was curled up in a corner of her cell, bleeding, shaking, broken. The woman who had always talked her way out of everything had finally run out of words. Rebecca watched from her own cell as Amina was taken away, her once proud shoulders hunched, her face pale with fear. For the first time she felt nothing. Not hate. Not pity. Just nothing. Amina had taken everything from her. Now, fate had taken something from Amina too. Years passed. Rebecca never left prison. She never saw the outside world again. But one day she received a letter. No return address. Just one sentence written in bold handwriting. I forgive you. Rebecca's hands trembled as she held the paper. It wasn't from Amina. It wasn't from a stranger. It was from Mara. The one person who had loved Ezekiel as much as she had. The one person who had every right to hate her. But instead she had let go. Rebecca closed her eyes, gripping the letter. Forgiveness wouldn't set her free. Nothing would. But for the first time in years she felt the weight of her sins lift, just a little. And for the first time in years she let herself cry. Not for Amina. Not for herself. But for the son she had lost. The boy who had only ever wanted the truth. And who had paid for it with his life. This story is a chilling reminder that fear can be the deadliest weapon of all. Rebecca Adeyemi spent her whole life hiding, terrified of what society would say if they discovered her truth. But in the end, it wasn't society that destroyed her, it was her own silence. Ezekiel never wanted to harm his mother. He only wanted to understand. But instead of trusting the bond they had built, Rebecca let fear consume her. And that fear cost her everything: her son, her freedom, her very existence. Amina Bello, the woman who claimed to love her, never truly loved her at all. She was willing to sacrifice Rebecca the moment things got difficult. And in the end, Rebecca learned the hardest lesson of all. You can hide from the world, but you can't hide from the truth, because the truth always comes out. And sometimes, it comes at a cost you can never repay. Fear can be a prison. Silence can be a death sentence. And the people we trust the most? Sometimes they're the ones who betray us. What do you think? Was justice truly served? Should Rebecca have paid the full price for what she did, or was she a victim of her own circumstances? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And if you found this story gripping, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new true crime story. Because in the end, every story, no matter how dark, deserves to be told. Until next time, stay safe,